Hi, my name is Bec Barnett and my project is incorporating First Nations land management into technical approaches to water modelling. I'm the project manager and strategic designer. My project set out to explore the way that First Nations land management practices and Indigenous knowledge can interface with the technical approach to water modelling, because we recognise that there's over 60,000 years of knowledge held by First Nations peoples within Australia, and that knowledge is really highly valuable in terms of thinking about landscape rehabilitation and restoration. Our project produced a series of different reports, but beyond that, we really feel like it established an excellent relationship with our project partners, specifically in St George. And we also produced a video where Artie K. Blades, who is a Manandangi traditional owner, explained the significance of the particular site that we're looking at. We also explored how we could communicate in an interesting and simplified way a reimagined water modelling pipeline and the importance of water modelling and what water modelling is used for. I am really proud of how this project has further extended the conversation around the inclusion of and celebration of Indigenous knowledge and First Nations land management practices within the water modelling space.
This project is incorporating First Nations land management into technical approaches to water modelling, and it was a pilot study to establish frameworks to incorporate Indigenous knowledge. So Relative Creative is based on the lands of the Yugambeh speaking peoples, water technology, the Yarra, which I'm now going to go home and look at a little bit more after this morning, and Turrbal peoples. And the project site was primarily on the land of the Manandangi peoples. So I want to pay my respects to all First Nations people in the room. The team, and okay, I'm going to try and not talk as fast as I talk when I get up and present. The team is made up of myself and Tristan Schultz as part of Relative Creative. We're a First Nations-led strategic and visual communication design practice. I'm not First Nations. Tristan is Gamilaroi. Water Technology, who are water engineering and environmental consultants, primarily Talia Rossi, Dr. Errol Lamb and Ben Tate. Artie K. Blades, who's a Manandangi traditional owner, and 5-6 Alliance, who are First Nations land management practitioners, primarily Victor Stephenson, Leighton Lee, and Dr. Peter Stanley. The rest of the team is actually on site in St George. I'm not sure if I got the raw end of the deal. I feel like I might have. But it also means that you're missing the technical expertise to answer technical questions, and the First Nations perspective, which hopefully is woven in throughout the presentation, but I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone. So the intention of the project was to better understand how Indigenous knowledge and First Nations land management practice could be incorporated into the water modelling pipeline, specifically for landscape rehabilitation and landscape resilience outcomes. I've put remediation in brackets there because talking to Daryl within Water Tech, his perspective is more and more that we should be talking towards remediation in recognition that perhaps rehabilitation into past states is not viable, and that maybe we should be promising that. So the project focused entirely on the site of Munga Lake, which Munga means ear in Manandangi. So it's a site that was significant for listening, and it's also known as Lake Munya. And that's out in St George, which I've kind of tried to place the location of. It's about a 6-hour drive from Brisbane, 6.5-hour drive from the Gold Coast, and Arnie K joins us from Toowoomba, so it's a 4-hour drive for her. That's a little picture of the site, and I just wanted to talk to terminology. It's interesting, a lot of the work Tristan and I do, because we're designers, we often work in the arts space and we work within the various First Nations spaces as well. So sometimes we forget that people aren't always familiar with the terminology that we're using. So throughout the presentation, we've primarily used the term First Nations to describe Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples, communities, cultures and knowledges. Occasionally we talk about Indigenous knowledge, and that's because this term is widely used within academic fields focusing on Indigenous studies, decolonisation and other similar fields. And our use of that term relates to that broader field of study, which is global. We really try to, when we're discussing a specific nation or country, peoples or culture, for example, the Manandangi Nation, to use that nation's name, understanding that because often, or always, those nation names have been transcribed phonetically, there's often variations in spelling, and we try really hard to always capitalize proper nouns. So I'm actually, sorry to let everyone down, Kate, I'm not presenting the recommendations around protocols for engagement. That did form a key part of our literature review and gaps analysis, and was reported on in that phase of the project. I think, again, Tristan and I probably take some of that for granted because we work in that space quite a lot. So we're familiar with the access protocols, but also work by people like Dr. Terry Jenke around ICIP, and how that's practiced within the arts. But our literature review had looked at the historical impact of colonisation on water and water rights, and how that is a shifting field, but how that also impacts thinking around things like cultural flows, cultural use, but also the way we think about the value of First Nations knowledge and First Nations land management practices. And then we also did a bit of a gaps analysis around what are the limitations that people within the industry are feeling is preventing or limiting their engagement with First Nations peoples, and tried to kind of keep being mindful of that throughout the project. We then stepped through into phase 2, which was facilitated engagement out at Lake Munga Lake, with Arnie K. Blades, and we met with the St. George Aboriginal Rangers as well while we were out there. That was documented in the phase 3 outcomes report, which Water Technology then drew on for their technical report, and it's kind of that journey that informs this presentation. It also informed a reimagining of the water modelling pipeline. So Talia did point out that maybe we should have had the existing pipeline in here as well. Didn't update that bit of the slide. We have had feedback that obviously most pipelines aren't built circularly. So maybe we'll have to reimagine the name as well. But the purpose of this visual was to really look at each point of that water modelling pipeline, which hopefully many of you are familiar with, and think about where First Nations engagement was happening along that pipeline. So within that scientific understanding and traditional knowledge space, you're co-designing the project scope between technical leaders and First Nations knowledge holders. And I agree that absolutely should be extended to co-designing what the budget looks like as well. It's one of those pieces that's very much chicken and egg too, because we all know that to have an effective project, you need to make sure that there's budget and time built in from the very start. But we also recognise that bringing people up and saying, hey, can you help me put a budget together? I don't have any money to pay you to do that work, is also problematic. So it's working through those sorts of questions. Informing, I'm actually not going to go through this. This is an outcome. It's something that we're interested in kind of continuing to further develop and test and seek feedback on. But that was kind of one of the visual outcomes of the project. The next few slides, and I'll try to keep to time, are around our key findings and then what we're recommending in response to them. So in terms of action and application, this goes to that identifying that further funding for traditional owners and Aboriginal rangers to implement practical landscape rehabilitation works on the ground is likely to have environmental and social outcomes. I feel like I'm stating the obvious, but I think that was something that was really obvious within the project. So we proposed test casing how data can be gathered by traditional owners and rangers and how that could be implemented into technical projects and models. So further investigation into what type of data and whether it's of interest or fitting for traditional owners and or Aboriginal rangers to receive training to undertake project-specific data collection independently or alongside project partners. And obviously that's going to vary from project to project, from nation to nation, and so on and so forth. We've mapped them all against the QWM and priority actions. The intention of this presentation is also kind of as a final report for the project. Again, I think, Jenny, we're making these available to people, right? So, yeah. Another issue that we identified was that there's this kind of conservation versus active land management mindset that comes up quite often. Often the Western concept of landscape conservation, wherein landscapes are maintained in their most natural state, contrasts to the millennia of First Nations land management practices that use a wide variety of techniques and practices to actively alter and manage landscapes and landforms for sustainable use and ecosystem health. So we're seeing that and the juxtaposition of those two things come up in the public conversation around cultural burning. I think with cultural burning, that conversation has moved forward, which is really exciting. But it's still this moment of conflict that I think we need to work to overcome. And we propose in relation to this early consultation and whole of project collaboration with First Nations knowledge holders to be more reflective of active management. So greater awareness and value of First Nations knowledge and land management practices, collaboration on the technical projects, and looking at how that would contribute to increased climate resilience, and making sure that that occurs throughout the water modelling pipeline through a co-designed approach. And when I'm saying co-design, yeah, it's become a buzzword. Definitely, we see that in the design space as well. There's many papers around it being a buzzword. So I think just always checking back that what do we mean by co-design and are we practicing it in its truest principle? So valuing and modelling Indigenous knowledge kind of links back to that past point, but we recognised within the work that we were doing that more work needs to be done across the industry. So working with industry, working with universities and education providers to support culturally responsive engagement and a values shift to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is valued within landscape rehabilitation projects. I mean, I'm saying landscape rehabilitation projects, pretty much every project I work on, there's this education process that needs to be underpinning moving forward. So we're proposing a more collaborative approach to technical projects, including First Nations knowledge holders in designing the project scope. So making sure that that consultation is included throughout. One of the things, and this is something that we're exploring more in part 2 of this project, which I can say that we've got now, is that there was definite interest in the ability of water models to provide further insights to traditional owners and Aboriginal rangers, including to identify the limits of rehabilitation works, and the impacts of climate change and the use of modelling to inform decision making and funding applications for landscape rehabilitation projects. So there's greater opportunity there for knowledge exchange between First Nations knowledge holders and technical and modelling professionals for collaborative potential. And I think Kate, Jim and Travis's project really touched on that. I actually feel like our 2 projects kind of go back and forth on like, we found this and it's like, yeah, we agree, which is great. At least they're not conflicting. Funding, jobs and training is really important. And again, I think all of these points really relate back to each other as well. So if you're going to incorporate First Nations land management practices into landscape rehabilitation, it requires funding First Nations peoples to apply their knowledge to country. And this funding then needs to be ongoing because we're recognising that it's not just like this band-aid solution, but it's continuous active landscape management. And that we need to be able to ensure that that can occur long term. And again, there's further support that could occur in the training space, ensuring opportunities for country-based knowledge to be shared and practiced, and that engagement with water modelling can occur. So our proposal here is all around increasing funding, jobs and training, increasing policy and guideline requirements to actually include First Nations knowledge in landscape rehabilitation projects. Again, the question of remuneration and following protocols, so important, and really thinking about how that can be embedded at the front end of the project when you're doing your budgets, when you're setting your timelines, when you're making agreements around ICIP, data sharing, all of those sorts of things. Investment in supporting and recruiting First Nations peoples into university courses that lead to careers in landscape management and rehabilitation, but there's corresponding jobs on country for that, if people desire that. Government and industry recruitment focus and internship programs supporting First Nations peoples entering the workforce, and industry bodies raising awareness of collaborative project approaches, which I feel like QWMN is doing quite well. Another really important one, and I think we've talked around this in a few of the projects as well, is data sovereignty. So the quote that was pulled from engagement is "our knowledge, our data." And this is something that we see in a lot of different projects, and people like Uncle Bob Weatherall have done a lot of work connected to this space. So that the concerns around losing control of First Nations data were shared, and there's a recognition that data is valuable, right? So why should other people be being enabled to profit from that data? So data sovereignty is a recurring theme, and there's a direct quote from my answers there. But it's not just data sovereignty over the data being collected on a particular project, right? It's thinking about all of the data that exists within different institutions that has been gathered and collected by different projects over the last 200 years, and how people are given access to that. So there's it's like data agreements now, but also can we think about ownership of data that's been collected historically, and how people can engage with and reconnect and find that data. So further data definition and identification of types of data, incorporating Indigenous cultural intellectual property, and really thinking about how that underpins an engagement. And again, establishing co-designed guidelines, so recognising that there's not necessarily a cookie cutter approach for every engagement and every nation that you engage with. This is the only slide on practices and protocols. But so we found there's a lot of guidelines and protocols that have been published. And yeah, there's pages and pages and pages and documents of those. Generally, most of them don't disagree with each other, which is a good starting point. But we feel like there's further work to train and support industry representatives in meeting those protocols, and kind of in thinking about that, recognising that consultation fatigue is a real thing. So that's where people are just consulted with all of the time, because they're local, that they're the spokesperson of the as a traditional owner, and they're not seeing any flow through of the project. So it'll be, can we talk to you about this? Can we talk to you about this? Often not remunerated, or remunerated with Coles vouchers. And then there's never any, or not never, often there isn't follow through, or an outcome that is provided back to that person that has been consulted with. So then for a new project, you go out, you try and talk to someone, and they're like, well, why would I spend my time? Okay, cool, you're going to remunerate me, but I've shared all this knowledge, I've not seen it go anywhere. No one's ever come back to me and told me what the outcome of this project has been. And sometimes that's because there hasn't been an outcome of a project, but I would argue that you still need to be going back to your stakeholders, to the people that you're consulting with, and saying, this is where the project has got to. I believe it's stalled because of X, Y, and Z. How would you like me to keep keeping you in the loop? So it's thinking about things like that to really keep supporting engagement. So we propose that really valuing the roles of trained and experienced engagement practitioners in projects can be really important. There are people out there like myself who have experience working in that community engagement and consultation space. I do not have experience understanding data and modelling. So I'm not going to try and pretend that I can do that. I think sometimes it's important to engage professional engagement experts because often we have the experience from past projects that we can bring to the new project that avoid some of the pitfalls that are fallen into sometimes. A massive one, and it's one that's come up a few times, time and budget. Probably don't need to labour that. There's many reasons for thinking about the timeline of a project, but really also ensuring that there's sufficient budget in there to pay everyone properly for their knowledge and expertise. Potentially considering a First Nations advisor and project review role, and thinking about how the project can be designed to be culturally appropriate, respectful and responsive. And again, that accountability of decision makers for post-project communication and implementation is really important. So we heard at the start of the day that we're continuing a part 2 version of this project. It has an equally long title, but we're adding case study to it now as well. And this is the rest of the team this morning at Lake Munga. So you've got the QMDCL St George Aboriginal Rangers, the Water Tech team, and Tristan, and I think Auntie Kay. Tristan's hiding Auntie Kay, but Auntie Kay is. I didn't use the mouse. Sorry. There. And basically, this iteration of the project is starting to try and apply those learnings from part 1. So this site visit, even though we've got a bit of an idea of how the project will run, and that's how we applied for funding, this site visit is all about scoping and setting objectives. So identifying those ideal state outcomes with traditional owners and Aboriginal Rangers, setting targets to achieve through the project. This site visit, which will then further help us think about specifically what we're going to look at in terms of environmental degradation. It'll help inform a more extensive desktop assessment. And we were envisioning conducting water balance modelling, identifying a water regime required for remediation. But that's kind of open to being determined during this site visit. And through that, identifying the physical works that might be required, the models that relate to that, and then presenting and discussing those results back on site at St George, and determining a priority of works that will occur, and then moving into that implementation phase, recognising that 2-year project is not going to fix a highly degraded site that has many limitations associated with things occurring within the catchment that I'm not even going to pretend that we're going to have any control over. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Bec. Any questions for Bec before we'll have a quick open discussion and then some lunch?
That site is contested ownership. Those people. So, yeah.
So my understanding of.
Just repeat the question.
Oh, okay. The question was around contested ownership. I know St George has Manandangi and Gamilaroi crosses borders, and yeah, the specific site, general consensus seems to be that that specific site is Manandangi. But in saying that, and again, this is where Western perspectives complicate First Nations perspectives, right? Because historically borders wouldn't have been such a hard line, but the native title process and the way we like to do our maps solidifies some of those boundaries that often would have been more fluid. So yeah, our approach has been that we've been advised to, we're building on an existing project around weed eradication that engaged fire sticks and cultural burning, and the QMDCL St George Rangers and Arnie K as a representative of Mananangi peoples. And so we're continuing to build on that relationship for that specific site. But yeah, recognise that it's super complicated. Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. And I think that's definitely a risk. There are Gimilori members of the Aboriginal Ranger group as well, but it hasn't been flagged with us that we should be seeking further consultation on that specific area. Yes.
Travis.
No, I just got a comment on it. Can you say something? But you're only using name, which there could be hundreds of thousands of people who are using all the different views. You could use any. Why would you put the that group's corporation and use the, if they have a corporation, or is that person? And there is a registered RTC over the area. What we wouldn't do if there's a practice for elections and the person at that time that you're dealing with the project, who is the chairperson, is the elected member for that area.
Yeah.
And this is what we have. We've got to do breaking package between the politics and practice. For its system, AGMs are involved. So you could have a chairperson today, and it's time at an election, if you're doing chairperson who may. I'm just interested why you've used someone's name and not the actual group, if there is a registered corporation group for the area.
My understanding is that there isn't a registered corporation group for Mananangi. Yeah, yeah. So we've been following an existing relationship that was established through an earlier project. And we haven't had, when we've been in St George and engaging with the Rangers and INK, haven't had anyone flag concerns with that, but I do understand that it's a really complex space. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, other than James Brown,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Just
I will have to follow up on that and seek further clarification, but yeah, thanks for flagging that.
That's a little complexity. So, all the time, but, you know, we've had long-term relationships with people, involves. When it gets complicated with people who are actually in the court system, it's very difficult to understand and negotiate. Have to do it the right speaking personally, you don't always get the best outcomes in terms of from that item. Adding to the very good. Yeah. Particularly when you've had the Olympic Games for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think like I would like to take those points on notice and have more of a conversation with my project team around that and seek further clarification, because I don't want to, overstep or make assumptions any further than what we've presented.